In addition to being a timeless representation of quiet strength and unwavering integrity, Tom Selleck, who has permanently etched his image into the hearts of viewers with his iconic roles as Frank Reagan in Blue Bloods and Thomas Magnum in Magnum Pie, also represents an irreplaceable chapter in the history of American television. He has played roles for decades that have made a lasting impression on our collective memory, providing millions of people with not only amusement but also a unique sense of trust, intense admiration, and the heartbreaking longing for a bygone heyday. But now, at 80, behind that calm and steady look, there is a chapter that is dark and filled with sadness. A place where he is surrounded by deep loss, the unrelenting hold of a failing body, and unsaid suffering that seems to be trying to test the heart and fortitude of a man who has dedicated his life to helping others. There are stories that, once heard, will reverberate in the heart like an echo, making it impossible to forget, as well as unspoken realities and secret sacrifices. Let your like serve as a silent but enduring homage to this extraordinary artist. If Tom Selleck has ever inspired you, or if his work has ever evoked something deep inside of you. The guy that America eventually trusted was initially molded in a loving home, but he was also influenced by the silent struggles that educate a youngster to stand strong before he is ready. Tom Selleck was born in 1945 in Detroit, Michigan, into a post-war society that was still in the process of healing. A period when nothing was taken for granted and stability had to be gained. His father, Robert, was a well-behaved guy with a steady but stern gaze who worked relentlessly in real estate, not for fame or fortune, but only to provide for his family of 6. Even in the face of little resources, Tom's mother, Martha, dedicated her life to raising Tom and his 3 siblings, providing warmth in their humble house. When Tom was just 7 years old in 1952, the family packed up their belongings and relocated to Sherman Oaks, California, in the West, a choice motivated by the prospect of more prospects rather than the allure of Hollywood. The young Tom grew up in that sun-drenched suburb, close to Los Angeles but far from its glitz. He was more at ease listening than taking charge, and he had a keen understanding that life wasn't always fair but could still have purpose. There were no expensive vacations or fancy automobiles. Values, discipline, honesty, humility, and teachings instilled in him by love and expectation were the family's true assets. I received something from my parents that money couldn't purchase. Decades later, Tom would recall, in a quiet but firm voice, as if still keeping those words close to his heart. They taught me to be steady when life isn't. Sports turned into a haven for him. Additionally, basketball had captured his heart by the time he was a teenager in the early 1960s, giving him perseverance via hard practices and quiet setbacks. His discipline was observed by coaches. His manners were admired by his teachers. However, Tom only ever saw himself as someone who was striving to do things well and never as someone extraordinary. One step at a time. There were evenings when the house felt smaller than their expectations due to the strict discipline his father modeled, but nobody voiced any complaints. Comfort was unable to replace the voids left by love. Then, at the age of 17, life dealt him a shock for which he was unprepared, an unexpected vehicle collision on a typical day. The sort that makes you look up at the sky and marvel how the world can change so quickly. Although the wounds were not fatal, they had a much more profound impact than mere scarring. They served as a sobering reminder that even the best laid intentions can be derailed in an instant, and that youth is not unbeatable. Weeks later, friends witnessed him return to the court, moving a bit more slowly and pausing for a moment before firing a shot. However, Tom had discovered something within himself that no coach could impart: how precious the people you love are and how fleeting time is. He was awarded a scholarship to the University of Southern California in 1962 as a result of his perseverance. He was the type of teammate that others could rely on because he was reliable and consistent, not because he was the most impressive player. Unaware that destiny had already sown the seeds for a different vocation, he majored in business administration and dreamed of a career in real estate, possibly following in his father's footsteps. In retrospect, those formative years were not without hardship. They were subtly molding a young guy to gracefully bear the burden of upcoming adversity. Success would eventually be defined by promises maintained, battles fought with dignity, and a life lived with unflinching integrity, according to the boy who formerly measured it by points scored on the court. By the time the Sherman Oaks boy was in his early 20s, life was already setting up to test him in ways that would leave scars much deeper than the naked eye could see, even though the world had already tried him to the core. In 1965, while attending the University of Southern California to finish his degree, he was drawn into a realm he had never explored by a single unexpected offer from a theatrical coach. A small theater class that will change his life in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. He found a new discipline, a team unlike any he had ever encountered, and a method to communicate with people without ever raising his voice on stage. He started taking on the tiniest roles because he was determined to fulfill this new calling. Commercials for soft drinks and grooming goods, faceless people in television backgrounds, anything to keep him near his job. Anything to keep the spark alive. For the dream he was only beginning to adore, it was survival, not glamour. Then, in 1967, when he was only 22, that brittle momentum broke. Tom joined the California Army National Guard and served with the 160th Infantry Regiment for 6 arduous years after receiving a draft notice without pausing to consider his options. He would remember it plainly later. I never considered the potential costs. I simply knew that I had to do it. However, the price was genuine, and each year it grew more severe. 6 years away was not a pause in a field that is fixated on youth and timing. The object was an eraser. The few doors that had started to open were securely sealed by the time he returned to civilian life in 1973. The flat truth was all that was present, no handshake from fate, no welcome back. He was older, unheard of, and now up against people whose futures had been put on wait as his was. He made a fresh start. Single lines, guest spots, and situations that are so brief that you could blink and miss them. Then followed the silent, relentless rejections. Before the public ever saw them, 6 separate television pilots that promised a breakthrough were buried. With the same careful, methodical care, as if putting a dream to rest, he folded the script each time he received a call from his agency, thanked them, and hung up. You begin to question whether you are merely practicing for a dream that you will never have. Later, he would acknowledge that the grind was harsh, the pay was insufficient, and that the distance between where he was and where he wished he was growing colder and wider with every season. But he would not give up. He continued to attend auditions, train at the Beverly Hills Playhouse, and take on parts that most actors would turn down because he thought that skill gained in anonymity was still valuable. The patience started to produce its first brittle fruit around the late 1970s. The consistency and quiet anchoring that gave each scene a sense of authenticity were what casting directors remembered, not the flair or the celebrity. Producers were drawn to that trait when he was chosen to play private investigator Lance White in the E. Rockford Files, a man whose modest charm and quiet confidence reflected his own. Critics and audiences took note, and for the first time in almost 10 years, things appeared to be changing. However, beneath the smile was the recollection of every door that was shut, every role that was forgotten in silence, and every year that was given up due to obligation and time. Tom Selleck learned more than just how to act during those slender, lonely, invisible years. When there was no applause, they instructed him to persevere, to pick himself up, to carry himself with dignity. And even though the world would eventually recognize him as a star, he developed into the guy that America would eventually trust in these protracted, punishing shadows. When Tom Selleck took on the position that would define an era in 1980 at the age of 35, the tide that had previously opposed him finally rushed forward. Thomas Magnum in Magnum Pie. The character's disarming smile, Hawaiian shirts, mustache, and quiet honor made him a fixture in millions of American living rooms almost immediately. A man that audiences trusted and felt familiar with. It was more than just a job. It was a phenomena of culture, But beyond the easy charm was a harsh reality that few could fathom. For 8 seasons in a row, Magnum, a weekly drama that lasted an hour and was shot mostly on location in Hawaii, required 12 to 14 hours of work each day, 6 days a week, under a relentless sun. The timetable left little time for recuperation and much less for a personal life, testing stamina as much as skill. Production overshadowed the holidays. Milestones and birthdays were celebrated on set or in hotel rooms, and family time turned into priceless memories that were taken in between flights back to work. Tom would later remark, "It was the best job I ever had, but it took a lot out of me, more than I realized at the time." This statement alluded to the unseen price of living up to a part that everyone loved. However, even at the height of this achievement, fate delivered a brutal and indelible blow. He lost out on an incredible chance to play a great movie character in 1981, not because he didn't make it through an audition, but rather because he decided to stick to the deal that had originally given him Magnum. He lost a place in movie history as a result of his honorable choice, a compromise that will break his heart for years to come. A poignant reminder that devotion in Hollywood can have the highest personal cost. Knowing that millions of people were watching and hoping for him to always be flawless, he continued to push through the pressure of expectation week after week. The pressure never let up. Overnight script revisions, network pressure to perform better, and the silent worry that one slip up may break the connection with a viewership that had given him such a high. The stillness that followed Magnum P.I.'s eventual termination in 1988 at the age of 43 was nearly bewildering. The industry that had once pursued him now appeared to hover at a distance, questioning whether he could be more than Magnum. And the silence felt like a blank after years of nonstop movement. The similarities and the constant rumors that he might never be able to shake the shadow of his most well-known character followed the roles. Before being released, some scripts that promised reinvention failed. Every setback was accentuated by the spotlight of public expectations. But despite everything, Tom remained faithful to the values that had led him from the beginning, choosing only work that felt right, even if it meant turning down big offers, feeling the silent pain of missed possibilities, and starting over on his own terms. Casting directors continued to admire his uncommon steadiness and capacity to give a scene a sense of realism. And eventually, this trait brought him well-received parts in TV shows and movies that demonstrated his versatility and durability. However, his peaks paradox persisted, a life surrounded by the radiance of celebrity both on and off TV. The silent, devastating math of what it had asked of him. Tom learned more from those years than just how to run a successful television show. They taught him the price of believing in himself, how to bear the weight of expectations without losing his composure, and how to have the grace to bear the emptiness that even the brightest spotlight cannot cover. Even though the world would initially remember him as Magnum, a closer look would reveal a guy who had faced both sacrifice and victory head-on and had walked through both with pride. Tom Selleck appeared to be leading the kind of life that most people could only imagine during the prime of Magnum Pi in the early 1980s. The man in the red Ferrari who always had the solution, the easy smile, and the rugged charm were all visible to the globe. Off-screen, however, a much more agonizing tale was being told, one that no camera could mitigate. The foundation of his personal life collapsed in 1982 when his profession reached a fever pitch. After supporting him during his difficult years, his marriage to actress Jacqueline Ray ended in silent ruin. To the general people, it was just another tabloid headline. However, Tom would later acknowledge that it was the worst thing that had ever happened to him. In 1971, when his name was not well known outside of casting houses and advertisements, they were married. Jacqueline remained steadfast in her belief in him throughout every rejection, failed pilot, and exhausting day on set. Using the erratic income of a working actor, he had adopted her small son Kevin and done his best to raise a family. They had endured more hardships together than most couples do in a lifetime by the time Magnum Pi made him a household celebrity. Despite all of its benefits, Celebrity is rarely kind. A popular series has unrelenting demands. 16 months without the peaceful rhythms of home, weeks of publicity travels, and our shoot days. Slowly the strain set in. Initially, it was just the lack of meals together, followed by missed anniversaries and talks interrupted by fatigue. Those who knew Tom remember how his shoulders seemed to bear more than the daily scripts, despite the fact that he was not a man to openly discuss personal suffering. During press junkets, there was a hint of grief in his eyes and a slight hesitancy before responding to inquiries about his family life. When the divorce finally occurred, it was characterized by the agonizing silence of two individuals who were unable to heal the rift that success had created between them, rather than by cruelty or public scandal. It was referred to as irreconcilable conflicts in the papers. For Tom, it was the loss of a companion who had known him before the world made up its mind about him. Someone who had been there before the limelight. He would think about it years later, so I figured we could wait. However, sometimes life and love simply stop intersecting in the same spot. His voice was one of peaceful acceptance, not resentment, as a man who knew that time and situation might erode even the strongest of connections. Even as he confronted the strange silence of an empty house, the timing could not have been more cruel. He continued to be Kevin's father, respecting the role he had chosen the moment he said, "I do." His personal life was in ruins, even if his career was giving him the kind of recognition he had fought for decades to achieve. It is among the most scathing ironies of life to stand in front of millions of loved ones and quietly ponder how to restore the spot where you felt most secure. Magnum PI's set served as a reminder as well as a haven. He was preoccupied with the 8 scripts. However, the private laughter and family dinners had vanished. Nevertheless, Tom maintained the same quiet honesty that characterized his work even when he was experiencing heartache. He refused to transform grief into performance and said nothing negative about Jacqueline. According to those closest to him, he learnt the most difficult lesson of all during those years. Love is not about possession, but rather about having the guts to let go when holding on will do more harm than good. Yes, the experience left wounds, but it also created room. Room to think about the kind of life he still aspired to create and the kind of partner he wanted to be. He also possessed something that is uncommon in Hollywood. A conviction that it was still worthwhile to wait for love in its purest form. He wouldn't find it in Jilly Mack for another 5 years, a lady whose presence would ground him in a manner that celebrity could never do, and whose laughter would fill the quiet spaces. Tom Selleck was the unwavering hero of Magnum PI for the fans. He was always prepared with the ideal line and remained cool under duress. However, the guy himself discovered in 1982 that even the most resilient people can be defeated. That shadows can appear even in the radiance of achievement. And maybe that truth lived rather than merely acted was what made his heroes on TV seem so real. Less than a year after the silent destruction of his first marriage, Tom Selleck took a plane to London in the summer of 1983 for what was supposed to be a short getaway. An opportunity to escape Magnum PI's maelstrom and take a breath away from the cameras. His fame was at its height. His name in American living rooms, his face on magazine covers. In private, though, he was still getting used to the quiet that awaited him at home. A fellow actor recommended that they watch the West End musical Cats, which was a huge hit, one evening. Never one to chase the spotlight at a theater, Tom accepted more out of politeness than interest. His focus, however, was drawn to a single artist whose enthusiasm appeared to illuminate the stage from inside as the lights went down and the first notes rose, rather than the ornate set or the glittering costumes. Rumple Teaser was being played by Jilly Mack, who was animated, elegant, and had a childlike smile. And in that capacity, she managed to create the illusion of intimacy in the packed auditorium. Tom was unusually anxious as he lingered in the foyer after the last curtain came down. Later, friends would make fun of the fact that the man who had defeated villains on film was unable to properly identify himself. But he managed to do so. And something in Jill's laughter. He was left with a laugh that seemed indifferent to the fact that she was addressing TV personality, Tom Selleck. He kept going back to view Cats in the weeks that followed. The tall American in the audience had caught the attention of the cast by the third visit. Making an impression wasn't important to Tom, though. It was about experiencing something uncommon after experiencing so much loss. The silent thrill of potential. Jilly was kind, witty, and unfazed by the glitz and glamour of celebrity. For a man who had recently discovered the frailty of love, he hadn't realized how much he needed the relief she provided. They did not engage in the type of romance that was widely reported in tabloids. Dinners hidden away from the flashbulbs, lengthy discussions about books and family, and afternoon strolls through parks in London when nobody gave a damn about Nielsen ratings were all part of it. Jilly met Tom as an equal, not as a hindrance to his success, and she had her own profession and interests. After 4 years of fostering their romance out of the constant spotlight, Tom and Jill were married in a small, private ceremony in 1987. It was purposefully quiet, purposefully theirs, and everything his previous wedding had not been. The way Tom gazed at Jill, as if he had been given something too valuable to express, is still remembered by many who were there. For Tom, the purpose of this second marriage was not to satisfy a need. The goal was to create a life. They would own a property in Ventura County together, away from the spotlight of Hollywood. A spot where the continual hum of studio labor was replaced by the sound of horses and the fragrance of hay. Tom famously changed his career by declining opportunities and rearranging his schedule to spend more time at home. Years later he would remark, "I knew what I didn't want to lose again," a blatant reference to the lessons he had acquired from his previous marriage. When their daughter, Hannah Margaret Selleck, was born in 1988, their happiness only grew. Tom didn't take fatherhood lightly, especially in the calm of a secure marriage. From bedtime stories to school performances, he was resolved to be there, to be present in all the moments, no matter how big or tiny. Friends saw that he had changed. Once solely motivated by the demands of show business, the man now gauged success by the stability of his personal life. It is easy to view their encounter as fate in retrospect. Tom, however, would explain it in a different way. It has nothing to do with fate. It all came down to timing and being prepared to see the good when it presents itself. Life was not done testing him, and that heartbreak-bred readiness would serve him well in the years to come. The family was strong, the ranch was peaceful, and love had made a comeback in a way he could trust. However, a sudden shadow would appear over their house, just as it appeared that the storms had passed. A challenge to the core of his job as a father, rather than his career. And this time, the battle would take place in the quiet, sterile corridors of a hospital, rather than in front of cameras. When Tom Selleck's second wife, Jill Mack, gave birth to their only child, a daughter they called Hannah Margaret. In 1988, at the age of 43, his life was irrevocably altered. She was more than a passing phase in his life. The center of it was her. Thanks to Magnum Pie, Tom was already well known, but his happiness now outweighed all the accolades and press coverage. Years later he would explain, "I knew nothing else would matter as much from the moment I saw her." But happiness gave way to worry in 1991 when Hannah was only 3 years old. At night, a fever that had appeared innocuous in the morning turned into a scary battle for air. The diagnosis of acute pneumonia that the doctors gave Hannah sounded clinical to outsiders. But to Tom, it was a decision that could end his life. It was heartbreaking for Tom to see his little daughter in a hospital bed with monitors and tubes all around her. The only thing the man who had confronted danger on TV could do in this situation was to grasp her hand and hope. His universe was the children's ward hallways. He committed to memory the monitor's sound, the antiseptic scent, and the way Hannah's tiny fingers coiled around his. Jilly remained by their sides, their quiet laden with unsaid prayers. She made progress on some days, but then setbacks shattered their hopes once more. Hollywood was taken aback by Tom's decision. He took a 3-year hiatus from performing in 1992 when his career was at its fastest. No major announcement, no news release. Just the simple belief that being there for his young kid was the most important thing. "I could never get back the time I might lose with her," he thought afterwards, "but I could always make another movie." Hannah had recovered and discovered a new passion by the mid-1990s. She started riding horses when she was 4 years old. She was also participating in show jumping by the age of 10. Tom was constantly at the rail, a proud father who watched his daughter overcome challenges with the same tenacity that he had once had when pursuing his own goals. They were put to the test once more by fate in 2018. When Hannah's magnetic stirrup failed to release, she suffered a devastating fall while competing at the famous Spruce Meadows in Calgary, Canada, at the age of 29. Suddenly, the vivacious athlete who had survived childhood illness was on the ground. She has 2 fractures in her leg. The fibula and tibia both broke. The announcer's voice faded into a nervous murmur and the audience fell silent. For Tom, the scene was a gruesome reminder of her early years spent in hospital hallways. But with different stakes. No longer was his daughter a helpless youngster, but it hurt just as much to see her in distress. It took Hannah a long time to recover. Months on crutches, numerous surgeries, and countless physical therapy sessions. Every stride forward was accompanied by resilience and pain. Tom and Jilly were there through it all, just as they had been in 1991, demonstrating once more that their family's definition of love was presence rather than inconvenience. Hannah has returned to the saddle today, stronger than before. Her equestrian sports career is flourishing once more. The fall that might have ended her passion, the pneumonia that almost killed her as a youngster, and the shadow of those times still linger in the silent corners of Tom's memory. These are the parts he appreciates most in all of his years in Hollywood. The watchful father in the hospital chair, the dependable figure at the arena fence, the man who sacrificed all for his daughter. Maybe that's why Tom Selleck is still trusted in America today. Because he is a father who has twice faced the unimaginable and remained, despite his notoriety and roles. The man who had it all decided to hold on to the one item he would never be able to replace. Carrying a personal burden greater than any character he had ever portrayed, he had just survived the long nights and delicate days of his daughter's illness. A man who has fought that kind of fight is quieter, more thoughtful, and more conscious of how brittle the things we cherish may be. However, a new chapter in his work life required a different type of strength, even as his home life started to regain equilibrium. In Blue Bloods, he played Police Commissioner Frank Reagan. He came back to the screen with the calm determination of someone who still had something important to say, rather than the swagger of a man seeking fame. He endured the torturous pace of lengthy filming days, unrelenting writing, and the unsaid strain of keeping a program afloat as the years passed for 14 seasons. It wasn't any simpler than when he was younger. His body was only now reminding him that time is of the essence. It takes longer to memorize lines. With the use of studio lamps, days that started before sunrise dragged into the night. Additionally, the network itself put the show to the test in its last season rather than the scripts. The actors and crew had become a family, but budget shortages endangered that. He immediately agreed to a 25% wage cut with his co-stars. A silent sacrifice to allow the narrative to conclude how it sees fit. Just a guy bearing the burden so others might complete the trek with honor. No headlines. No press releases. When filming was over, there was sincere farewells and hearty applause. However, the ensuing quiet was more acerbic than any farewell. It was the end of 14 years of upholding justice, loyalty, and family values. And once more, he was left to face the big unknown without the security of his regular job. It served as a reminder that even the longest-lasting chapters come to an end, and it was simultaneously a source of relief and grief. Tom Selleck had established a haven away from the cacophony of Hollywood long before Blue Bloods, before contracts and call sheets could control his days. California's Hidden Valley is home to a 65-acre property. Once held by Dean Martin, the property was acquired in 1988 and turned into his haven, where he and his wife Jilly reared their daughter Hannah, surrounded by horses, oak trees, and the open sky. Here, under the California sun, he mended fences, planted thousands of trees, and dug ditches by hand.